Returning to the U.S., where prosecutors have dropped 2 criminal cases against President-elect Donald Trump. The cases related to alleged attempts to overturn the 2020 election result and the mishandling of classified national security documents during Trump's first term. Let's cross to Washington now, where I'm joined by Julia Manchester, political reporter with The Hill. Julia, good to have you again as always. Can you first explain to us why the special prosecutor Jack Smith dropped those 2 cases?
Yeah, so he's dropped these 2 cases essentially, because we are in the aftermath of the election. We see that, former president, now President-elect Trump has won the election. So, after that, the aftermath of that, him going into office, there has been this long ongoing question of presidential immunity. If Donald Trump would be, liable for a crime or have to face a crime while in office. So there's a question as to whether Jack Smith could bring these cases again, in 4 years after Donald Trump leaves office. But a lot of this has to do with the election, the fact that he's heading into the office, and that it would be, I think, sort of a legal headache for prosecutors to continue this prosecution while he's in the Oval Office.
Of course, it's the very early hours of the morning where you are in Washington. Now, surely we can expect at some point today that the Trump team will sort of capitalize on this development in the context of the January 6th riots.
So they've actually already done that. So this happened yesterday now, so hours ago, really. So we've already seen them capitalize on this, say that this is, that they've won, if you will. They've declared victory, saying that this was, a so-called witch hunt against the former president, by the federal government and the legal system here in the U.S. So they're already talking about that, already capitalizing on that. But really, it comes in the midst of a presidential transition. So we have President Trump trying to get his cabinet members confirmed through the Senate, figuring out what that process looks like. So, it's gotten attention, but at the same time, I think the Trump team is looking to move on so they can hit the ground running once he's inaugurated in January.
Either way, though, would today's decision or yesterday's decision where you are by the prosecutor have any bearing perhaps on the other cases he's facing as well as his hush money conviction where he's awaiting sentencing, although that's been delayed?
So the difference between the cases that were thrown out and the 2 other cases he's facing in New York and Georgia is that these 2 cases were federal cases. So the federal government essentially threw them out. But in New York and Georgia, it is up to the judges in those 2 respective cases, which are at the state level. So, and for the sentencing case in New York, that will be up to the judge. We'll see if the judge moves on that. We know that the prosecutor, Alvin Bragg, is certainly pushing for that sentencing to happen before he enters the Oval Office. There's a chance it could happen after he is president in 4 years. In Georgia, we know that the prosecution in that case has faced a lot of backlash for their handling of the case. We know that the district attorney, Fani Willis, was involved in a romantic relationship with one of her assistant DAs, one of her staff members. So that sort of convoluted the case and raised a lot of questions as to how it moves forward. So those are 2 very different cases. So I don't think at the federal level it will have as much bearing on the state level.
Yeah, speaking of the 47th presidency, now Donald Trump is beginning to stamp his authority by announcing massive tariffs, but it's Canada and Mexico copying the worst of it, followed by China. What's been the reaction to this?
Look, you have, his supporters, who like his so-called America First agenda. They like this. They see this as the former president, now president-elect, standing up to other economic powers and putting, American workers first. However, there has long been a concern among many economists here in the United States that slapping these large tariffs, on goods, overseas goods, will, have an adverse effect. We know that Donald Trump has talked about lowering inflation, but there is a concern that these tariffs could essentially heighten inflation or raise the prices of these goods and services coming into the United States. Donald Trump and his supporters would argue that, he put a number of, enacted tariffs during his first administration. The Biden administration did nothing to overturn those tariffs. So it's sort of an ongoing debate, but there's certainly some concern that this could have this adverse effect.
Yeah, and are Republicans among those who are publicly fearful of what you've just mentioned, the adverse impacts of these tariffs?
Absolutely. This is, like I said, this has been, voiced by economists, by some Republicans. So he's getting some pushback within the Republican Party. Look, this message of economic populism, which includes in many ways tariffs that the former president has pushed, hasn't been embraced by all Republicans. We know that the Republican Party has certainly changed during the Trump era, and this is just one aspect of it. We know that the Republican Party used to be much more, without Trump, more global free trade, but this is just a sign of how much it's sort of morphed in the past 8 years or so.
And Julia, is there an expectation from the rest of America's allies, including Australia, that they too are on notice?
I think there certainly is. I think Donald Trump, announcing these tariffs this early on, obviously they won't go into effect until he becomes president in the middle of January. But I think it certainly sends a message to our allies, and trading partners going forward that Donald Trump, is essentially calling the shots here.
Julia Manchester in Washington, thanks very much.
Thank you.